Hi, this is Paul. I wonder how many of you remember The Sopranos. It was a very popular TV show a while ago, and the premise of the show started out in a very interesting way. Tony Soprano is a mob boss, and he's having panic attacks, and he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to keep his life together. His life is too complex, and there's too much drama in his family between him and his mistress, and with all the lieutenants and everything going on, and he's having these panic attacks, and if he shows any weakness, or he could it could mean his life. And so he goes to a therapist, and well, now the therapist has a problem because she wants to help Tony. Well, what does helping him mean? Does it mean he becomes a better husband? What should he do with his guma? Does it mean he becomes a better killer? And this is the premise of The Sopranos, and in many ways, the question that was asked by the show lingers today in this very interesting cultural moment we're experiencing right now with Jordan Peterson and the debates that swirl around him and morality and all of this. In the video I posted, the third video I posted on the Jordan Peterson monk debate, I went through the entire Strange Persistence of Guilt, which was in the Hedgehog review, and you can look up my last video. I'll put a link to it in here. And that video very much gets at this idea of the strange persistence of guilt, that the more power we have, the more responsibility we have. So suddenly we find North Americans, especially young North Americans who lean to the left. Suddenly we're responsible for environmental degradation, and we're responsible for sins that have happened centuries ago, including the genocide of the Native American population, and the subjugation of Africans, and the slave trade, and the ongoing weight of guilt of whiteness, and on and on and on. And the point that Wilfred McClay makes in his piece is that we're showing various ways of trying to deal with this guilt. And one of the ways we're trying to deal with this guilt is appropriating victim status, because if we're a victim, then we're not a perpetrator. And if we're a victim, then we're not responsible. And then we can point fingers at those responsible, and we at least then won't feel guilty, because we will place ourselves on the right side of history, and we will be bending that long arc of history towards our way, and we will be cheering there with whatever the Jenner girl in her Pepsi commercial is on the victory. But none of this is simple, and none of this is simply welcome. A question that haunts behind it, which is very seldom asked, is the question of moral knowledge. And in many ways, that was the question that was stalking the conversation between Jordan Peterson and Matt Dillahunty that I did a number of videos about. Dillahunty wants to talk about knowledge and truth and morality, and Dillahunty wants to use a referential standard for truth. We know that something is true when we can point to an objective reality out there. Do I have $1 million in the bank? I can go to my bank account app, or I can go to my bank and say, do I have $1 million in the bank? Let me give you a hint. No, I don't. If someone wants to make that true, be my guest, go right ahead. But I do not have $1 million in the bank. And so we have this referential assumption about truth. And this is very much the materialist's assumption of what truth means. And so Peterson starts playing around with that, especially when you get into the questions of ethics and morality. And again, that's the place we are in terms of my conversation, which looks like it's been paused, but really hasn't been paused, in terms of C.S. Lewis and his book Miracles. Can we verify that something is true if we can point to it out there in the physical world? But most of what goes on in our day-to-day life isn't verifiable in this way. What about love? Do you love me? Well, a pragmatist might say, I know that you love me if you act in a way that I identify as being loving towards you. Oh, but do you really love me? Or the question, will you always love me? And, well, questions about this and institutions like fatherhood. Fatherhood is not the kind of institution that you can point to a building like an institution of a college or a school or a government. Fatherhood is an institution, but it's not a material institution. Can we have moral knowledge or true knowledge about fatherhood? Or can we have true knowledge about marriage? What is marriage? Marriage has been an institution that is greatly debated, not only in terms of who is permitted into the institution, such as must they be male and female? Is the sex of the party unimportant in terms of the institution? Is the number of people in part of the institution? Basically, as a culture, we have serial monogamy, which means one at a time, please. But if I say I want to be married between 3 or 4 people, well, this is out of bounds, and we say, well, that violates what marriage is. Well, what is marriage? How would we know what marriage is? And so these questions about truth and morality get very, very complicated. Now, of course, Jordan Peterson weighs in here with his schema, and he says, materialists are Newtonian. They're looking at objects, and there's way more stuff that is actually involved in this. There are hierarchies which are involved, and we prioritize some things over other things, and story governs stuff, and we see tools. And so Jordan Peterson wants to talk about being and knowing, and so when he's talking with Matt Dillahunty, Jordan Peterson will keep saying things that really annoy Dillahunty, like, well, you act like a Christian, and Dillahunty's just offended by this. No, I'm an atheist. Well, all this entire system that you're assuming in terms of your moral matrix, you've basically bought it all from the Christian store, and now you're just putting another label on, but we all know where it came from. You didn't derive your morality in some clean, rational logic, some clean room, which was free of contamination from theists and these other things that you're calling superstition. And so that's how that conversation goes. And so a guy like the Rationality Rules guy, he has Jordan Peterson's truth debunked, because Jordan Peterson will make some claims about truth which seem very, very strange. Jordan Peterson will say, well, how do we know that the hydrogen bomb is true if in fact the hydrogen bomb extinguishes human life? So by Jordan Peterson's definition, the hydrogen bomb isn't true. And I use the explanation about tiger bombs. And again, you can go back through my videos. I've walked through all of this stuff before. And so Peterson has a Darwinian definition of truth and says, you Newtonians are really claiming to know more than you can know. And truth and consciousness is far stranger than this imaginary schema that Dillahunty and Sam Harris are putting forth, that if Jordan Peterson would say, I'm more skeptical than you are about truth. In fact, I found my truth on a Darwinian platform. The only thing I can know to be true is that which contributes to survival. And of course, Rationality Rules wants to use a referential system of truth, which says, no, we know things are true if we can point to them in the broader world. And so again, Peterson says that which is most true is what helps us survive. And this is more skeptical than the verification method, because you need to have a faithful subject if you are going to verify something. And this gets into some videos I made, and I'll just have some short clips. Here, of course, is Don Hoffman, who's done some study in evolution, and he says contra the people who say, no, evolution, there must have been some truth that came to us through evolution, and we just build on that little bit of truth that we got through evolution, because creatures that see the truth will outcompete creatures that don't see the truth. And Donald Hoffman says, no, Darwin says it's fitness. It's not this this situation that we imagine we know the truth. That's an illusion. And again, I've talked about this in past videos. And this is in many ways exactly what the materialists were saying. This manifest image that we're living in the middle of is a complete illusion fabricated by our brains, and the hope of this group saying that, well, we're getting some truth through evolution, and that's what we're scaling up, and that's what's affording this rationality that we seem to be enjoying, and the products of it, and that gets into Scott Adams, who I'll mention a little bit later too. This is how we know truth, because we get a little bit through Darwin and then we just scale up, and this is how we develop and progress and how we know truth. But now Hoffman comes along and says, that's a load of crap. I'm able to simulate evolution, and guess what?
Who wins? Well, I hate to break it to you, but perception of reality goes extinct. In almost every simulation, organisms that see none of reality but are just tuned to fitness drive to extinction all the organisms that perceive reality as it is. So the bottom line is evolution does not favor vertical or accurate perceptions. Those perceptions of reality go extinct.
Now again, when he says accurate or veridical perceptions of reality, he is talking about exactly the measure of truth that Dillahunty and many other popular atheists are. This is what he says. Dillahunty says, well, we know truth because we can verify it with other things. And what he's saying is, via evolution, we are not wired to be able to do that. What we do is adapt to our situation, and the rationality arguments are really post hoc rationalizations to factor our camp. Now, if you think this through, you might say, well, why haven't the atheist materialists really won the day? Well, if you listen to Don Hoffman, you would say, well, I know why they haven't won the day, because we're all just acting post hoc. And the Christians are basically saying, it's us, and the others are saying no, so it's just all tribes.
Now this is a bit stunning. How can it be that not seeing the world accurately gives us a survival advantage? That is a bit counterintuitive. But remember the jewel beetle. The jewel beetle survived for thousands, perhaps millions of years using simple tricks and hacks. What the equations of evolution are telling us is that all organisms, including us, are in the same boat as the jewel beetle. We do not see reality as it is. We're shaped with tricks and hacks that keep us alive. Still, we need some help with our intuitions. How can not perceiving reality as it is...
And he goes on from there, and I'll put the link in the description, and you can keep watching it. But there we are. So when faced with this, well, does evolution select for truth seeing? Well, here's another debate.
So, like I said, there's no guarantee that any particular brain is going to actually reason correctly. And what I will say is that logic is not something that is, or the foundations of thought aren't something that are produced by a brain. They are truths that we recognize. They are the truths demonstrated by a simple Venn diagram that something is either A or not A. That's it.
You're not answering the question.
Okay, the question is, how can a brain produce logic?
How does a brain restricted to physical laws of chemistry and physics? I'm just going to use motion, matter, chemistry, physics. How does that produce proper logical inference? As you said, which I think is very interesting, is not dependent upon the human brain. I totally agree with you. Well, then that means your brain, my brain are different brains. We can't use your brain or my brain to be the standards of logical inference. We can't. We both agree. We both make mistakes. We're both not perfect in our logical thinking.
What do we point to?
We apply to something else these laws of logic. Now, the issue is
Correct.
the physical brain. Yeah, and they're outside of ourselves.
Correct.
The physical. Oh, there you go.
It's
yes.
that they don't exist
yes,
as things.
yes. He's
They are
moving
not,
towards my
they
side.
are not
Theism.
contingent upon any individual's thought. They don't exist as a thing.
So my question is, how does the physical brain, where one chemical state relates to another chemical state or changes to one, how does it produce proper logical inference? Does it?
Can it?
Can it?
Yes. Otherwise, we wouldn't.
How would you know?
Because we can recognize it through the logic that we just talked about. So,
Wait a minute. If your brain's saying that, and that's all that is of physical chemicals, you can't say that to be true. Because you don't know if your brain's saying that is right. You're just saying that.
This is the real issue here, and this is truth. What's the definition of truth according to you?
Well, look, the issue
No, if
here...
you're going to make truth and logic the foundation of it, we ought to get this out.
Truth is that which corresponds to actuality and or logic.
The correspondence theory of truth.
Okay, so we agree on what truth is. And so if truth is what corresponds to actuality and logic, then when a brain reasons, you take the output of that and see if it correlates with logic and with the facts of reality and reason.
But the problem is, if you are in a cage of physical chemical reactions,
Yes.
you cannot ascertain whether or not those conclusions properly relate to the truth.
So the assessment doesn't have to be done solely, which is why science
Now, what does he mean by that? By yourself? Solely?
relies on independent affirmation. Now, you can...
Independent of what? Independent of human beings? We can't get independent of ourselves. This is what I've talked about in terms of the monarchical vision. How are you going to attain this? How could you see it? How could you interpret it?
And I will agree, at the end of the day, maybe all of us are wrong. And you know what? I agree.
And that's pretty much where we're left. And again, if you go back and you look at the article that I've posted before on the heretic from the Daily Standard, talking about Thomas Nagel, this is where we're at, boys and girls. And this is part of where Peterson is getting at these guys. So now, and this is where, Scott Adams is at. And so Scott Adams has his two views. And so on one hand, Scott Adams will kind of agree with Sam Harris, but disagree with Sam Harris vehemently over Donald Trump. Is Donald Trump a hypnotizer who's hypnotizing the nation to make America great, or is Donald Trump an evil man who's doing other things? And again, you can go back over my videos and watch those. Now we'll get into this question of, well, how can we know the truth? And we've got, we might sit here with atheist conversations and say, well, the truth and blah, blah, blah. But the part that the coven in the Berkshires of dealing with Thomas Nagel and the heretic is, well, we're talking about this esoteric truth, but when the car doesn't start, the car doesn't start. And we all look at how much money we have in the bank, and we all live this normal life. And this entire conversation seems completely devoid of it. It seems completely away from it, or does it? And then we look at the flashpoints of our societal conversation, and we do have questions about this.
Yeah.
Right.
Saying that you should do it.
No, that you had to do it.
Right, you had to do it by law. But just for clarity, do you think a trans woman is a real woman?
I don't really like the way those questions are formulated. I don't know what that means. What do you mean a real woman?
Well, I'm asking you, in your mind, it depends what you think a real woman is, but do you think a trans woman is a woman?
Now, we could jump in with Bill Clinton and say, it depends what you mean by is.
No.
Why not?
Because I think that women are capable, generally speaking, of having babies, and they have female genitalia, and they have an XX chromosome, and I think the biological markers are relevant. It doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think that people should be treated with respect and dignity if they happen not to fit easily into a gender category. That's a different issue.
Right.
But it's a matter of definition. And I actually think it's a foolish argument in some sense. Because what do you mean by real?
Well, I mean,
What do you mean by real? Now we're really knocking on they're knocking on the door of Dillahunty and Peterson. So you've got this idea. Now we're also knocking on the door of ancient philosophy. Does woman, in terms of this particular gender, correlate to the form of woman in the heavens? Is that what we're talking about? Are we talking about, the laws of physics? Well, what are the laws of physics say in terms of what a woman is? Are we talking about how do we treat someone as if they're a woman? If a trans woman goes into a doctor's office and demands says that she has prostate cancer, well, how does the insurance company regard her? Say, I'm sorry, we're not going to pay for your prostate cancer because you're a woman and women don't have prostates. and the doctor to say, well, I have to treat you as if you're a woman. And so if you come to me and you say, I have prostate cancer, and you tell me you're a woman, I'm thinking I need to probably refer you to a psychologist because, well, don't refer to Jordan Peterson, or maybe you should, or, depends what is. And so all of these questions about knowledge and reference actually have a great deal to do with the kinds of things we're talking about in terms of our society. But now this very quickly then gets into morality as well.
Just pick up on one thing you said a little earlier in the interview, which you said it's the moral guidance that you are focused on. You think that is particularly important.
Sorry, I had to take a phone call. Let's go back.
How guidance that you are focused on, you think that is particularly important. How do you square that with the behaviour of perhaps arguably, a prominent alpha male president of the United States, Donald Trump? When his behaviour, he is accused of having an affair with a porn star when his wife was pregnant. How does that fit with morally reclaiming?
I would say that was rather clearly immoral.
Right.
Yeah,
but you would still,
not to be a target for emulation.
But you still would have voted for him over Hillary Clinton as an identity politics. It's just how
none of
do
that
you
was on the table, and I said I might have voted for him on a whim. That's all.
But you also did say you started out feeling quite close to Hillary Clinton. Can I just come on the
very quickly, because we've got to move on.
In a way, I don't care what Trump does in terms of his private life, but what I don't have is him stopping or potentially stopping other women having agency over their reproductive rights, and lots of men taking those decisions.
It's all about where the moral outrage lies, and what's more morally outrageous in people's eyes. Is it his behaviour or the identity politics for you on the... Anyway, we'll have to discuss this another time.
It's about where the moral outrage lies, and it's about where, well, here's the funny thing. Do we have moral knowledge or not? If we have moral knowledge, we're not in a position to judge one another, are we? We're not in a position to condemn one another. If now, again, you go back to, let's say, Delahunty, well, we know what's right and wrong. And if you read, say, Soul Searching, Christian Smith's sociological survey of young Americans in the 90s, Americans generally believe, I know what's right and wrong. It's instinctive to me. It's innate to me. Well, maybe I learned it from my parents, but right and wrong is simply self-evident. Well, then we run into pluralism, and what's self-evident for you isn't self-evident for me, and how can we come to agreement? And then how can we, in fact, have things like national policy? And so where does in fact any of this go? So can we have moral knowledge? We're back to this. And how can we have moral knowledge? And if truth is this referential thing, yet moral knowledge is not like cats and dogs and presidential mistresses, how can we how can we know these things? How can we verify these things? How can we know truth that has to do with actions? And in fact, what in fact is moral knowledge? Well, let's talk a little bit about the history of the Bible and the truth. And I've run through this in some past videos. I'm going to run through it again. I'll probably run through it again in the future. The medieval period, there was polysemy, which is the idea that the Bible had multiple interpretive layers. In fact, the ancient church had this too. Origen had the Bible is analogs. And so when Augustine had trouble figuring out what to do with Genesis and the current scientific regime or understanding of how the Bible was, then Augustine punted to some allegorical interpretation of Genesis, or perhaps we might call it a mythological interpretation of Genesis. And of course, in Jordan Peterson's biblical series, he's offering a mythological interpretation of the Bible. And so this was quite common. If you read ancient sources or medieval sources of biblical interpretations, if there was a problem with a certain way to approach a text, those exegetes would kind of switch gears, and then the Song of Solomon, which is this seems to be some erotic love poetry is really a story of Christ and his church. And so on and on this went. And so there were multiple layers of the Bible. It wasn't debated whether or not the Bible was true. It was assumed that the Bible was true, but then the question was, how is it true? And it could be true in terms of multiple layers. It's also important to recognize that there were two speeds to the Christian life, and you'll find this in other traditional religions such as Buddhism or Hinduism. Almost any religion that has a clergy or a priesthood or a monastic orders. And the idea is that monasteries hold spiritual athletes who accommodate credits that the church can allocate, such as the practice of indulgences, which Martin Luther protested to so strongly. Regular people support the church with service and money in exchange for prayers and credits. And for example, during Martin Luther's period, it was believed that God would have brought the apocalypse and brought history to its end, if not for a certain group, I believe, of Cistercian monks who were praying quite fervently for more mercy and more time for people to come to the Lord. And so the Lord had withheld the apocalypse. One of the interesting things, if you look back through history, almost every generation believes that we're in the last times now. If you read the New Testament, and you have Paul and Jesus talking this way. So of course Christians should talk this way, but this then gets into the culture and into biblical interpretations, and it goes all kinds of different ways. Then the Reformation hits, and the Reformation happens within the context of Renaissance humanism and the finding of the texts from the East and the ability to, Erasmus lining up the Latin Vulgate with Greek texts he had available to them, and then seeing some of the ways in which the Vulgate and the Greek texts differ, and that having some theological implications for the church, and the church not wanting to deal with it, and the Augustinian monk Martin Luther reading these and wanting to have a discussion about them and a discussion about other matters such as indulgences, and post his 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg church for theological conversation in Latin, and it gets translated by students into German and hits the printing press, which is the internet of its day, and pamphlets go out and woodcuts get made and so on and so forth. But the authority was found in texts and not in a corrupt institution. And so this is, Luther wants to reform the church. The church isn't particularly interested in being reformed. It's quite a bit more expedient to kill Luther, but because of the political patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire, Luther's political ruler, who is also his patron, basically says, "You're not killing my monk," and squirrels Luther away in a castle and protects him. And then Luther gets to translate the Bible into German, and Luther continues to write and do his work from the protection of the castle, and on and on and on, and it goes. Now polysemy wasn't taken on per se necessarily right away, but the text was used to critique the church, and the text becomes the standard for the Christian life. And then this of course births the Protestant churches, whereas, let's say, the Roman Catholic church might say, the church affords the text authority, and Luther comes along and says, no, the church has authority to the degree that it agrees with the text. And there's your basic differences between Protestants and Catholics. And of course, Luther then also changes the speed. You have the priesthood of all believers, and we're looking for a one-speed Christianity. And John Calvin wants to turn Geneva into a holy city, and laypersons are just as called by God as clergy, and clergy don't necessarily have any higher standing or status than laypersons. And you see, I'm not wearing a collar. How very Protestant of me. Now, I just probably opened up a can of worms there. But most of my pastor friends aren't watching, so I'll probably avoid it. But then in the post-Reformation, you have this suspicion of texts, and this happens through the post-Reformation wars. Now it's helpful to remember that this just doesn't just have to do with religion, but in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to learn physics, you studied the text of Aristotle. And then now coming into the 16th and 17th century, a new way of finding truth comes into fore, because we're suspicious about texts, and we don't quite believe that, we can necessarily get all the truth we need from the Bible. And so let's go out there into the natural order. And even, for example, the Belgic Confession, which is one of the doctrinal standards of the Christian Reformed Church, says that there are two books by which we can learn about God. We can learn about God from general revelation, which is the book of nature, and we can learn about God from special revelation, which is the Bible. And if you look back at my conversation with John Van Sloten with his book, here you go, John, another commercial for you, Every Day a Parable, he goes into the way that other people are called, and how God uses this, and how God speaks through nature, and how God speaks through other careers, and how God speaks through science, and so on and so forth. So truth is found in direct observation. You learn physics by testing and measurement. And of course, Newton kind of gets all of this going with Newtonian mechanics. But Newton is also doing alchemy. And when we hear that, we think, why is Newton doing alchemy? And this whole language of, it's probably the video I've gotten the most pushback on, laws of physics. Well, this language gets adopted. Why? Because this providential deism, where God makes the universe and like a clockmaker, God has laws for things, and things obey laws, and physics are so uniform, and these laws of physics are so uniform because God institutes them. God never changes, therefore his laws never change. But you see, over time, God is kind of taken off, and all of the language about law remains, and all of the assumptions about law remains, until Rupert Sheldrake starts poking his nose into constants and says, why is the speed of light changing? Why is big G changing? Why do we have the people who are here? Why do we even have institutions that are supposed to continue to maintain constants when you think you could just put them in a book and they'd be constant? And you can look up my Rupert Sheldrake video for what goes on with that. And so all of this stuff about the Bible and truth, this is all changing. And then we come into the 19th century, and the world is really starting to come apart. The 19th century was torn with the question of what kind of truth revelation could provide, because truth from science, and increasingly we're understanding history in a Newtonian way. Truth is observed by observation. And so history, we're so enamored by the powers of science that we try to turn everything into a science. Now remember, science is a far older word that talks more about knowledge, but we come to use the term science in a very different way, and this then becomes our standard for truth. And scientism says that the scientific method is the only standard for truth. But now think back again to the Dillahunty conversation and all of that stuff going on there, that this is reference. We measure gravity, or we measure the acceleration of a falling body, and that's a law of physics, and so therefore we can apply that in all different places, and this never changes. But now people like Rupert Sheldrake start sticking in their nose and say, well, how do you know it doesn't change? Well, we're pretty sure. But then, of course, you start getting into the world of quantum theory and quantum mechanics and the double slit experiment and all this other things. And people start saying, well, reality is a lot weirder than Newton said it was. Oh, you mean Newton, who did alchemy? Newton thought the world was plenty weird too, and Newton was a very devout man, probably died a virgin. I mean, Newton was a very strange man, but well, what is reality? I mean, as physics in the 20th and now 21st century, physics is beginning to say reality is weirder and weirder, but we've still got people running around with 19th century definitions and working with those. And now the pragmatists can lean on and say, yeah, but Newtonian mechanics for the most part is good enough. Well, once we say good enough, we begin to say, well, what if there are situations where it isn't good enough? Where are we going to find truth then? And again, what kind of truth? And so you have the split world in the 20th century. Darwin comes in. And so now, well, we can't trust the Bible for science or history. And we have all these questions about, well, what did the video camera see in the Garden of Eden? I mean, did the snake have lips, and did they move when the snake talked to the woman? And these were questions that appeared in examinations for Christian ministers in my denomination not too many decades ago. I know this because these pastors have told me this. So in the split world now, suddenly we start getting some pretty serious divisions. Modernism comes online, and a bunch of the churches then become modernists. And in a sense, in the 20th century, then the modernists say things like, well, the Bible can't talk about history or science, but the Bible is our guide to morality. Okay, so there we go. The Bible is our guide to morality and sexuality and all of this stuff we're going to learn from the Bible, but we can't trust the Bible for science or history. Fundamentalism, of course, comes and says the Bible is our guide and foundation for everything, including science. And you have the development of creation science, for example. Now, moderates and other ancient churches like the Roman Catholic and the Orthodoxy, they're trying to split the difference, because actually they've been having these conversations before the 19th century, unlike dispensationalism, which arises in the 19th century. And some of you, I'm sure, go to dispensational churches, and you can look up do a little research on the internet about what dispensational is, where it arose. But of course it arose out of something like this, because the dispensationalists were very determined to take the Old Testament prophetic literature very literally. So suddenly we now need to have Ezekiel's temple become a reality, and we need to have all of this stuff in Old Testament literature become literally fulfilled. Now, this then gets into disagreements theologically with the Lutherans and the Calvinists and the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox, all of which had read the New Testament as a revision of that and a fulfillment of prophecy, but in a different way. But of course, now the literalists say, no, it must be fulfilled. So then, of course, in 1948, when the State of Israel happens, all the dispensationalists say, see, it's true. And all the other people are like, but is that really Israel? And so now we have the split in Christianity over the State of Israel and Zionism, so on and so forth. So we have this split world, and all kinds of things are splitting apart. But then after the Second World War comes the Cold War. And the Cold War gives a tremendous boost to certain forms of Christianity in America, because we're locked in this existential threat with the Soviet Union. And the godless communists reject the Bible for history, science, and ethics. And of course, this is the church that the little young Jordan Peterson went to a little bit, and his parents weren't totally into it, but there were wide swaths of the Western world that kind of had that relationship with church. I mean, it was in some ways like back in the ancient world when, well, if you were living in a Roman colony in the Eastern Empire, well, of course you do obeisance to dead emperors, and to God and country are right there. And so then during the Cold War, "In God We Trust" gets stamped onto the coins, and "One Nation Under God" gets put into the Pledge of Allegiance. And suddenly, Dwight Eisenhower, whose mother was very religious. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower is now a big, cheerer of religion, because we need to mobilize the nation to stand against godless communism. And so church attendance during the Cold War reaches its peak in American history. Now, this is obviously something that's a little hard for some revisionist historians to deal with, who imagine that, well, we're all on this steady slope of corruption in America, and back in the 18th century, Americans were much more Christian. Well, it's like, yeah, but they didn't attend church necessarily, and it depends how you define Christian, and so on and so forth. So, after the Cold War, however, new threats are now religious, such as 9/11, religious fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, fundamentalists of various sorts. And now suddenly, well, what happens then to the assumption that the Bible is the source for our ethics. Well, once the Cold War ends, all of this starts to slide. And, well, now we're in a sense in a post-truth world. So what is a real woman? Can we know a real woman by science, by verification? If we, generally speaking, not too many years ago, we'd say XY chromosome, penis or vagina. Well, that's pretty much the standard for male or female in terms of sex. But now we have to say, well, how dare you go there? What kind of bigot are you? You are a moral monster if you use those standards for what a woman is. A woman is socially constructed. Well, and let's flip the two sides of the cultural war, and so those, many of those who are screaming about, what's wrong with Jordan Peterson and Donald Trump are together. I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting mixture. The guy's Canadian, and he's ruthlessly honest, sometimes painfully so. But so okay, what about your referential standard for truth? Well, there's going to be problems with that. But now, what about Trump? I mean, so on the one hand, the left is yelling about, of course, Caitlin's a woman. On the other hand, they're yelling, we're in this post-truth world. Donald Trump won't deal with verifiability in terms of the words he uses. And then you've got Scott Adams saying, well, it's hypnotism and it's persuasion. And if some truth gets exaggerated or you need some lying or so on and so forth, well, now suddenly, is Stormy Daniels a woman? Well, on what grounds? She's a woman because she says she's a woman, and Donald Trump says, like here, because of his status. I mean, you can reach out and grab them by their private parts. And I suppose if you want to make sure that you're actually maybe going to go to bed with the right sex, maybe you should grab them soon, because then at least you know what you're getting into. And there's no what was that movie? It wasn't the Hunger Games. It was the Crying Game. You won't have a crying. See, I'm dating myself. You won't have a crying game experience here. So where are we? And then you've got, the big discussion about evangelical selectivity. Bill Clinton was a liar, but Donald Trump is a baby Christian. And maybe he has problems with the truth, but we like his Supreme Court justices, so on and so forth. And again, if you start following through all of this, you've got a post-truth president doing things. I mean, it's just kind of chaos. And so people stop and say, what on earth is happening to the world? Well, if you look back, it's not that mysterious. The seeds of all of this are there. And again, I mentioned this weird business about guilt and absolution through victim status, and then also the sacred self, because here's the thing. If material referentialism isn't the standard for truth, if I am not a male or a female dependent on the chromosomes I have or the genitalia I possess, maybe the dominant thing is what I feel myself to be. So maybe I think I am a 6'4", 54-year-old. I am Shirley Temple trapped in a man's body. And you all look at me and say, "Oh, you're a white man," but I think, no, I'm a small girl who's going to be a movie star by tap dancing on the good ship Lollipop, and then as an adult I'm going to move to Africa. And you might say, well, that's just crazy because there's no referentialism in there. Well, so how do we know truth? And then again, it gets even harder to say, well, how do we know moral truth? So one of the things I did on my blog a while ago was do a kind of a review of David Brooks' The Road to Character, because Brooks kind of sets this thing up and says, after World War II and that generation that fought the Cold War, things changed. and things have changed quite a bit dramatically. And now it's the sacred self that determines who we are. So if Bruce Jenner in the 70s was a fantasy man because Bruce Jenner won the Olympics, and 1980, was it? I think it was 80 that he won the Olympics and had really hot wives and a house on Malibu and beautiful children. Well, how does this work? And now she's Caitlyn and she's a woman. Well, what happened to Bruce, and what happened to the Father's Day cards, and history, consciousness. Now we're in the now. So what is the relationship between the now, between being and becoming and what you have been, and how does this work? Well, I want to bring Dallas Willard into this conversation, and those of you who've followed my channel for a while know I've been wanting to bring Dallas in, but I take a long time getting places, as you can well see. Now, you might think I don't take a long time, but try watching all my videos. It'll take a very long time. So Dallas Willard lived from 1935 to 2013. He taught philosophy at the University of Southern California. His philosophical career centered on Husserl and phenomenology. His undergraduate degree was in psychology, and he's best known in the Christian community as someone who wrote quite a bit about Christian spiritual formation, which is basically ancient church practices for people today. And I've been trying to figure out, now, where can I bring Dallas into this conversation? And then I found some videos that haven't been much watched, and really, I'm just impressed by the power of the Google search engine, and really gets into this question about moral knowledge. Now, I don't know when he gave this lectures. It could be in the early 2000s at some point. The video quality isn't great, but let's listen to him.
Now, let's begin with the statement about what the disappearance of moral knowledge is. And I want to be very clear. I don't mean to say that there is no such thing as moral knowledge. There is. And your cases.
Now, again, right away, and when I listened to this, I thought, well, this is exactly the conversation we're having now, because moral, yeah, we all kind of know we can't live without moral, but knowledge? Because again, if you look at it in terms of the materialist frame of truth, can we have moral knowledge? And in a sense, Dillahunty says, well, we all know what right and wrong is. Well, he's being very American in saying that. And Peterson's like, well, don't be so quick and don't be so sure. There's actually quite a bit we can talk about with respect to this. Would Dillahunty be able to talk about moral knowledge, or is it only feelings? Well, Willard talks slowly, and he's not as exciting to watch as Peterson, but give him a chance.
You already know them. You may have some trouble placing them because of the confusion of our public discourse, but there is moral knowledge. I'm not going to say that no one has it. Many people do. Many of you have it. But again, it's very likely that you don't quite know what to do with it, especially in conversations, because the circumstances of our existence have changed in ways I will talk some about, so that we often are intimidated when it comes to moral issues. And
or maybe we should be more intimidated. At our current political posture is we just jump right in because, well, we're sure we know what right and wrong is.
I hope by the end of my little talk, or the end of the discussion sections at least, you may be clearer about why that is and what you might do about it. But let's just start with the description of the disappearance of moral knowledge. It is a social reality, and now on your sheets you have some wording which I like to bring and hand out, because if I just flash it on the screen, I think very few people get it down. And also, you can take this home with you and put it on your bathroom mirror or someplace. The disappearance of moral knowledge is the social reality that the knowledge institutions, primarily the universities and also the churches, and I put that in quotation so we can cover a little more than the Christian religious background. Knowledge institutions of our society do not offer knowledge of good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and vice to the public. They do not offer it as knowledge. It is not a part of testable cognitive content of any recognized area of scholarship or practice. Now, perhaps I can nail that down just by saying that if you were teaching and you were to ask a question about what is good or evil, right or wrong, obligatory to do or not to do, you would not be able to grade the student on the answer. And if you did grade the student and the student didn't like your grade, they could appeal that up the line. And eventually, if they were persistent, it would wind up in the courts. And perhaps as it went up the line, your dean or your administrator might say to you, now, Mr., Mrs., Professor, whatever, we of course know that it's wrong to run over children in the street with your automobile by choice. We know that's wrong. Or to kick a baby through a goalpost just to hear it flop. We of course know that that's wrong, but we mustn't impose our views on our students with reference to moral issues.
Now, bear in mind, this is 15 years ago at least. And so what's fun about listening to things like this is that things have changed. That, in fact, we are more morally assertive than we were then. But then the questions are, well, what are we morally assertive about? What has changed over the last 15 years? And is there any question about, well, on what basis are we making and justifying these changes over the last 15 years? And you will often find almost zero conversation about that. And in fact, everyone treats it like simply, well, it's just self-evident that these changes were justified. Really? Self-evident? Why self-evident now?
Now, I'm pausing just to ask you to think about that. I'm trying to make it as concrete as possible. What does it mean that moral knowledge has disappeared from our culture? It means that the institutions of knowledge cannot present moral truth or ethical truth as something of which there is knowledge. Okay?
Now, if you're listening to the Jordan Peterson conversation, well, what does Jordan Peterson say about the humanities in the university? Well, why does Jordan Peterson say you might as well get rid of them? Well, they're not teaching anything. Well, why aren't they teaching anything? What were they supposed to teach? Well, they were supposed to deliver moral knowledge, but they're not allowed to deliver moral knowledge. Well, now they're delivering moral knowledge. Well, from whence do they get their moral knowledge? Well, that's a very good question. Because if we can't have it, how can we be asserting it? How can we be demanding it? How can we be putting people like Jordan Peterson on the hot seat if he breaks from the herd where everyone says, well, we all agree that this is moral? Well, now we kind of have Animal Farm, 4 legs, those who walk on 2 legs and those who walk on 4 legs. And The winds change. Well, why do the winds change? You ought not to ask. You ought not to ask questions about why, because you know we can't answer them. Well, then why? Don't ask why.
Now, I'm hoping you're going to want to fight me about this, because I go around the world saying all this stuff, and if I'm wrong about it, I need to know.
And nobody fought him. Well, they're fighting now.
So you can help me by contesting what I say. I'm not interested in winning. I want to know what is the case. Okay? Now let's talk just a little.
And again, if you listen to this, you might think, well, this guy sounds like Jordan Peterson. Well, there's a lot of things that Dallas Willard and Jordan Peterson would not agree on. And I would love for Dallas Willard and Jordan Peterson to have a conversation. Well, Dallas Willard is dead, so that ain't going to happen. So that's kind of why I do it on my channel.
A little bit about knowledge, because of course the world is full of moral judgments and moral feelings and moral fights. And usually your evening news or your newspaper is full of bad stuff that people have done, and they're really coming down on them. The priests who have abused children, or pastors who have abused children sexually. Tiger Woods.
For those of you youngsters amongst us, Tiger Woods plays golf, and he was famous for his basically breaking his marriage with other women.
And on the list goes. Right? So we're loaded with emotions, with feelings, with fights, moral fights. See, the moral life does not stop. It can't stop. And this is a part of what I want to emphasize in a little while. The moral life is so central to human life that you can't call it off. Because the moral life has to do with choices that we make. And those choices have to do with the kind of people we become. And the kind of people we become is not a matter that is indifferent to us or to others.
The kind of person that Donald Trump is not a matter that's indifferent to us and to others. It just isn't. It matters.
You're in the realm of fact already when you get into morality, because morality has to do with life.
Now you can hear some of his phenomenology coming through.
So we can't dispense with it. We can't just say, well, we'll check out. I quit engaging in moral feeling, in moral judgment, in moral beliefs. You can't do that. No one can. So now we have to think about the significance that, with all of that true, moral knowledge is set aside. So now, next paragraph on your sheet, we have to talk a little bit about knowledge. Knowledge is what this university is about, I hope.
UC Irvine.
So if it's like my university, very few people are willing to talk about knowledge any longer. Again, check it out. I make a point, especially if I have a large freshman class, of starting out by talking to them about knowledge. The way I go about it is to say, why are we doing this? Why are we here? Why are you paying money? And engaging yourself for some lugubrious evenings setting up, studying obscure texts. Why are you doing that? You might be surprised how long it takes to get around to knowledge.
Or you maybe not.
Knowledge is scary. People are frightened of knowledge because they think it will pin them down. That's because knowledge involves truth. And the truth will not only set you free, it will make you flee. It's scary. Now, it's scary, again, because of its reality in life. See, we depend upon people knowing what they're doing in any area of professional work. You want people who have knowledge, not just sentiment, not just belief. If you hear your dentist saying, well, maybe that tooth is the one, you probably want to get out of the chair real fast. You want people to know. See, that's because truth is vital to life. Truth is like the sighting mechanism on a gun.
But wait a minute. I thought fitness wasn't about truth. But we can't live without truth. So what are we going to do here? Can we know things? And can we have moral knowledge?
If it's right, then you can hit the target. And truth is like that. Truth is what you need to hit the target. But truth is bitter. It does not make any allowance for what you think or feel or what you wish or hope. And if you're wrong, you're in trouble.
Now, the whole thing is good, and it's this good, and I'll put the links to it in the comments. Now, people approach psychology as a tool, and they say, "Doctor, can you make me feel better about my choices? I have divorced my wife and gotten a new one because the marriage just wasn't working, and my child isn't doing very well with it. So can you please make your child what? Make your child stop complaining that you drove a truck through their life?" Truth is bitter. Truth is hard. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have gotten a divorce. Maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. I'm not the one who can say that. I think we're fortunate to have a system that basically says, yeah, you get to decide, but with great agency comes great responsibility. And so here we are. And so we want to have moral knowledge. And this world is very difficult, and this world is very hard, and things come at us in life, and we make choices, and sometimes we choose what is right, and there are consequences and negative consequences for it. And sometimes we choose what is wrong, and it seems to work now, but will it always keep working, and will it work in the future? And so then when Tony Soprano comes to Doctor Melfi and says, I'm getting panic attacks, and my guma is giving me grief, and my wife is giving me grief because, everybody should have a mistress and a wife, but you just can't put them together. And why won't my, and all my lieutenants, they aren't behaving themselves, and I have trouble with the other bosses, and I don't know if I should whack them. And the therapist is like, if I make him feel better, he'll be a better mob boss. But is that what I'm here for? What is the job of a psychologist? What is psychology? Well, we live in the now, and we want to feel better. Well, when I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, often Haitians who had little or no money, they would get sick, and so they would go to the doctor, and the doctor might, as would here, prescribe 2 or 3 medications. Well, usually, one of the medications they would prescribe might be acetaminophen or ibuprofen, Tylenol, or Advil, and that, of course, would deal with the pain and deal with the fever. And the other medicine would probably deal with whatever was causing the pain or the fever. Well, if you have very little money, the acetaminophen or the ibuprofen costs almost nothing, and the other medicine costs quite a bit more. So what did they usually do if they only had money for one? They bought the acetaminophen or the ibuprofen. And what that meant was they never bought the medicine that actually treated the disease. They only treated the symptom, and then what you would imagine would happen. Well, so is there truth? We'd say, yeah, there is truth. And then most of us think about truth pretty seriously when it comes to the doctor. And we also think pretty seriously when it comes to the doctor, and we realize that the doctors themselves are limited. And sometimes they tell us right, and sometimes they tell us wrong, and sometimes they know the truth, and sometimes they don't. But the reason we esteem them so much and pay them so highly is that at least we hope they know a little bit more truth than we do, but we suspect that, so then we become our own doctors with Google and Facebook. So here we are. And so it might be tempted to sit there with Dillahunty and say, well, maybe we don't know anything. But we're sitting in this society which has walls and electricity and all these wonderful things. And, well, we've got to certainly know something. Well, how did we arrive at this knowledge? And what is this knowledge? And are we going to throw this knowledge away? And we don't quite know what we're going to do. So what if moral knowledge works on a different speed? Well, think about that. Well, suddenly we're at Jordan Peterson's Darwin test. And when he says, well, guess what? We're playing around with the pill. We have no idea what this is going to mean for us. And what do you mean we have no idea what this is going to mean for us? We found the pill in the 60s. That's 50 years ago. And Jordan Peterson comes around and says, 50 years? 50 years is nothing. And then others will say, well, the Enlightenment. And Peterson says, 500 years? 500 years is nothing. That's 5 old men. Well, how then shall we live? And I know a number of people have been writing me about Francis Schaeffer, and I do know something about Francis Schaeffer. But how then do we live? Well, then Jordan Peterson comes trotting along with his Bible and says, I think we ought to read this book. And I've been trying to read it, and I'm trying to figure it out, and I like thinking out loud and talking out loud, so I'm going to talk to you all, and if you're interested, millions of people are interested, or at least hundreds of thousands of people watching it millions of times. And as I talk to Peterson fans all over the place, are like, well, can't wait to get back to the biblical lectures. Is he going to start them again? Because the other stuff's kind of repetitious. And, well, yeah, he's building his audience, blah, blah, blah. But I really want to know truth, and I really want to have some sense of truth in my life, and part of me is suspecting that there might be something to that Bible. And Peterson comes along and says, I think there is something to this Bible. Just by virtue of, now he comes at it from below instead of from above, which tends to be where the church comes at it, and he says, there's stuff in here that seems true. And it looks true on these measures here, even though the church has been working on these measures here. And so the church looks over and says, well, those aren't our measures, so I'm not going to listen to you. Well, but truth is truth. And, I often will quit people, and people will say, well, I can't believe these geologists because I believe in the Bible. And I usually ask them, do you believe your doctor? Do you demand a Christian cosmology? Do you demand a Christian anatomy? Paul says, if we profess with our lips and believe with our hearts, well, does this thing pump blood? Or is this thing the thing that believes? Well, that's a metaphor. Oh, okay, good. I agree. But what happened if Paul believed that we thought with our hearts? Well, did he or didn't he? Well, that's a big question I'm not going to get into. Paul probably had some idea we used our head, but back in the ancient world, they didn't have a lot of idea what brain was about. But they seemed to have knowledge, and they seem to have moral knowledge. Well, am I splitting, like in the 19th century, history and science from ethics in the Bible? No, I don't think we should do that at all. I don't think we should do that at all, because all this truth was in this package before we split it. So, well, how can we see it with eyes before the split? Well, that's really, really hard, and I'm still working on that. But and that's why some people say, well, look to the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox, because their testimonies were before the split. Yeah, but the split still happened, and so we can't undo the split. We still have to think through the split. So what does that mean? Well, I'm a Calvinist. It means I trust. Well, what do you mean you trust? How can you know him? Well, trust isn't about knowing in the way that we usually talk about knowing. Trust is about trusting. Trust is about saying, okay, I might not know so much, but I'm going to bank on this. You might say, you shouldn't. Oh, okay. But here's a fun thing. I get to choose what I bank on, don't I? To the limited degree that I'm in charge of what I trust. Because in a lot of ways, what we trust is also constructed in this amazing mystery that we are. So you have Jordan Peterson's idea of Darwinian truth. It's very long term. And the Bible is very old. And in some ways, again, I've said this a number of times, there's no other book in all of human history that is more translated, that is more studied, that is more worked over, that is, I mean, they never put it on the bestsellers list because it would be boring, and maybe they don't put it on the bestsellers list because we as a culture would not like to face the fact that it would always be number one, and then they'd break down all the other Bibles underneath. We don't like that Bible. Well, why don't we like that Bible? Because it says things that we don't like. And I'm about to get back into the book of Kings in the Old Testament, and one of the kings is like, the king of Judah comes up and says, "Don't you have any prophet of the Lord?" And the northern king says, "Yeah, but he always says stuff I don't like, so I don't listen to him." And the southern king is like, "Well, maybe we better listen to him, because there's this thing about desire and will and truth." And well, Jordan Peterson says, often the place where you're going to find what you need to see is exactly where you don't want to look. Why? Well, because our watchers in the back of our brain are saying, "Oh, don't look there. If you look there, I might have to give up drugs or porn, or I might have to marry my girlfriend, or I might not get to do what I want to do." Well, I'll tell you something. You get to my age and the doctor says, "Well, your blood pressure's getting a little high, your cholesterol's getting a little high. Maybe you better start watching what you eat." I got to start watching what I eat. That's no fun. I want to eat what I like to eat. No, you got to start watching what you're eating. "Well, doctor, you have no knowledge." All right, you can say that. Go ahead. Eat what you want to eat. Avoid the doctor. You get away with it for a while. If the doctor's right, I'm not going to go off into the rabbit trail of nutritionism. Religious wisdom is multi-generational. And again, I've said before that in some ways you might think about religion as a Ulysses contract. Well, what's a Ulysses contract? Ulysses has his sailors tie him to the mast, but Ulysses has his sailors put wax in all of their ears so they don't hear the harpies. Well, why is he tied to the mast? He wants to hear the harpies. And what's he say to his sailors? "Don't listen to me when I'm listening to them." And because that's the whole gig about the harpies. Look it up on the internet if you want to know about Ulysses or Odysseus and the harpies. Jordan Peterson comes from below, but religion comes from above. And now we're in, however, the new moralistic age. Now we say, well, we know what's right and wrong. Well, when did Caitlyn Jenner become a woman? How can you answer that question? Can you answer that question? What's a real woman? What does it mean to be a fake woman? What is a woman? How dare you ask questions like this? Well, in 1980, it didn't seem to be a problem. Well, is woman different from 1980 to now? Well, yes and no. Well, in what ways yes, and in what ways no? Well, why don't you just keep it simple? Okay, there's nothing simple about this. Well, how are we to have moral knowledge? Well, I love the way Willard. Oh no, I didn't put in the link. Hang on. The amazing power of the pause button.
Public discourse ceases to support morality. Proverbial wisdom becomes corny.
Even the word corny is corny now. I haven't heard anybody use that word for 15 years.
That's corny, by the way, is worse than false. I like to compare it to electricity and knowledge of electricity. We once had no knowledge of electricity. Didn't even know what hit us when lightning struck. Now reflect about, we have a lot of knowledge of electricity now. And it's amazing what we can do with it. How we can cooperate with one another. How we can know whether or not someone else knows electricity and how to wire a house or use it in various kinds of instruments. What would happen now if knowledge of electricity disappeared? Knowledge. What would happen? Well, perhaps...
Now pay attention here. Now, you can find sci-fi things about this. Electricity's there. Knowledge of electricity. Well, what is knowledge? Well, what is knowledge? Think about it. What is knowledge of electricity? What does knowledge of electricity enable us to do? Now, again, stalking these Agendas of ours are our tool-like aspirations where they say, well, if I can gain knowledge, then I can gain control, and if I can gain control, then I can gain outcomes, and then I can bend the world to my will, and then I can indulge my desires. And so, none of this is easy or simple or gets us around anything, but this is a good metaphor.
Things would work for a while.
Let me back it up.
What would electricity disappeared? What would happen now if knowledge of electricity disappeared? Knowledge. What would happen? Well, perhaps things would work for a while. Sort of. Then the certain loss of huge amounts of what is good would come. Think of doing medicine without electrical knowledge and power, of household chores, or travel, or communication. It doesn't just depend on electricity. The electricity is still there. What has gone is knowledge. Now, can you transfer that to the moral life? It has been said for several decades, a century or more, that we have been living off of the moral capital of past ages. It won't last forever. And there are deep issues about our lives that cannot be handled without moral knowledge, which allows us, do you remember, to act, to direct action, to formulate policy and supervise it, and to teach. And that's what we've lost. Moral life is not just a matter of some rules that we might think are to prevent us from having a good time. Often what are presented as moral rules don't make any sense. They have to be corrected by moral knowledge, not just thrown away. Morality is a matter of what we're living for, the kinds of persons we are becoming. Moral knowledge is basically knowledge of this. Morality is not just conformity. Again, it's often thought of that way, as conformity to what is proper, but is about building a life. Now, this is the part, I think, that we need most to pay attention to. Life has a nature. Interestingly, that is one of the points that is most commonly denied.
Do you hear the Peterson, Brett Weinstein conversations about nature? Life has a nature. Well, why don't we want life to have a nature? Well, then we can create of it what we want it to be. We can bend it to what? So that we can indulge our desires? Yeah. Okay. But what if life has a nature? What if there is a truth? Well, then it gets complicated.
By recent thinkers, scholarship, even standard academic behavior. Human beings, you might think that a human being was a Brussels sprout or a squirrel from all you would hear. But human life has a nature. All life does. It has a structure. And moral distinctions are part of the reality which is human existence. Vice is a bitter reality, usually having to do with capitulation of the will and character to desire. This is the ancient moral battle that thinkers east and west from the beginning have understood. The problem is with desire and action from desire. How do you deal with it?
And for many of you out there, you know this because look at Russell Brand. Well, how has he come to spirituality? Well, desire. Will capitulated to desire, and it wrecked his life. And Jordan Peterson will say, yeah, by the age of 27, you reach this point, and you got to decide, what are you going to do? Well, now suddenly I figure out that my desires are not necessarily my friends, and I've got to do something. Well, what are you going to do? How can you manage desires? Well,
desire and action from desire. How do you deal with it? Desire is not something that considers what is best. It considers what it wants. And it does what it wants without regard to what is best. And now if you will think about all the garish cases that show up in our news and so on, you will realize that what is going on, the man that murdered the young girl down nearby has now been allowed to explain to us why he did it. If you listen to it, you will hear it was desire. Bill Clinton, when asked in an interview why he did what he did with Monica, said, I just could do it.
I just could do it. I have status. I have power. I just could do it. Well.
Now, he lied. Either intentionally or not, he uttered a falsehood. He did it because of desire. Desire is what poses the problem for choice. And unless you have knowledge of good and evil and right and wrong to counteract desire and say, well, I know you want that, but there's this other. See, choice and deliberation, the function of will is to present alternatives. And one of the main lessons that you learn when you begin to study ethics and morality seriously is that your feelings and your desires are not your will. But many people in our culture today, because of the disappearance of moral knowledge, do not know that. They think their desires are their will. And that is the source of many of the deplorable situations that we face in our life. The virtues, temperance, courage, justice, wisdom, faith, hope, love, are reliable sources of direction, strength, joy, and peace. This is the content of traditional moral knowledge. That was the content of teaching in this country. And you go back and you look at the old readers for grammar schools and the way people were educated, and you see that all over the place. But now people look at it and what do they say? That's corny. Corn, by the way, is very nourishing. You can do a lot with it. The 7 deadly sins are deadly. There was a theological meaning to that in the 14th century, but that's not the only meaning. Pride, envy, all of the other things that are listed, lust, sloth, all they'll kill you. They'll kill you. They'll ruin your mental health unless you have a way to deal with them. So now we have a series of difficulties. Last paragraph at last. Is it too much to think that our contemporary disasters, such as failure of covenants in family and business and government, obesity, which is now posing a financial and health, addictions of all kinds, crime, financial chaos, failure of the educational system, how much, if the teachers, students, and administrators in our schools were pursuing a life of virtue, how much would that change in our schools? That all of these rest in some significant degree upon the failures of the lives and characters of some people involved. and that those failures rest, again, in some significant degree, upon the disappearance of moral knowledge from our society in the sense explained. It would be a mistake, no doubt, to ascribe all of our problems to that disappearance. Not everything can be solved in this world by sincere effort, even if it's informed by knowledge. There are other problems, and we need to know about them and deal with them. But it seems to me that this disappearance has had and is having a very harmful effect on much of our life at present, and that is the responsibility of our institutions of knowledge to make moral knowledge available in the extent to which that is possible. Not by teaching rules, not by imposing condemnation or praise, but by the dispassionate analysis and communication of the nature of virtue and vice and character. Thank you.
And there's question and answers that he'll go into, and it's well worth watching. So again, I will put the links in the notes. Well, moral knowledge. Do we believe it exists? What would it be? How could we know it? What is the cost of believing it doesn't exist? What should we do? Well, what should Dr. Melfi do? Is moral knowledge a kind of thing that she has to deal with when she talks to Tony Soprano? Is moral knowledge something that Tony Soprano has to deal with when he thinks about his life? Where does it go? There are your questions. Hope you enjoyed it. I should post it this evening.